Conflict between Haman and Mordechai, which led to the Purim miracle, was rooted in events that had occurred many centuries earlier. Haman traced his descendant, Agag, king of Amalek. When we take a look in the actual book of Esther, Haman is called the Agagite, like, Canaanite or Israelite or whatever, Agagite. Except that when we take a look at the list of the different nations of the world, Agag isn't one of them. So Canaan is, so there are Canaanites. Israel is, so there are Israelites. Agag is not, so what's an Agagite? There is, however, a person, a human being who lived, whose name is Agag, and he was king of Amalek. So, in essence, Haman is an Amalekite, because he descends from this Agag king of Amalek, and he himself was an Amalekite. Mordechai and Esther were scions of the royal family of Saul, the first king of Israel. When the Jews left Egypt, Amalek was the first nation to attack them. So if you remember, we leave Egypt, 7 days later we're at the sea splits, the Egyptians are drowned, we're free, song of the sea, everything's great to go. We travel just a little bit further, and all of a sudden Amalek ambushes us and attacks us. As a result of this, the Jews were commanded, when God will relieve you of all your enemies, blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. In fact, on the morning of Purim, because it's a special day, so we have a Torah reading, in addition to the fact that we read the Megillah. We also have a Torah reading on the morning of Purim in the morning prayers, and we read from that very section where Amalek attacks us, where we wage war, we defeat them, and we get this commandment. Several centuries later, after Saul was crowned king, the prophet Samuel ordered him to fulfill God's commandment. Thus, the very same commandment that initially was given to the generation of Moses was practically supposed to be fulfilled by King Saul. The prophet Samuel tells him, "Smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that is his, and have no pity on him, slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." Just like the original command, blot out their memory, here we get more particulars. Saul gathered the Jewish people together and waged war against the Amalekites. He didn't balk, he didn't delay, 100% on board, seemingly, slaying the entire nation and destroying their property. So far, so good. However, there's always a however. He had pity on Agag, the verse there says, and the choicest of the sheep and cattle, and brought them back with him. Now, God tells the Jewish people all the way back to Moses, blot out the memory of Amalek. King Saul is told directly by the prophet Samuel, God said, everything destroyed. How in the world could King Saul just kind of, not do what he's supposed to do? King Saul wasn't stupid, and he wasn't wicked. He actually wanted what was best, what he thought was God's real intent, what would make God extra happy. And so, King Saul looks back at our exodus from Egypt, and he sees that even though Pharaoh was a firstborn, God did not put him to death with the smiting of the firstborn. And even though Pharaoh was at the head of the cavalry that was chasing after the Jewish people, and he went into the water, into the split sea at that point, right, chasing after the Jewish people, and the water came down on all of Egypt, nevertheless Pharaoh remains alive. The verse tells us that one person remained alive, and that was Pharaoh. Why in the world would God spare Pharaoh those two times when it was clear that he should have died? So that the person who nobody can say about them that really they don't know what they're talking about, they only got it from secondhand information, the guy who was in the room, as they say, can say to the rest of the world, there is a God, it's the one God of the Jewish people, of Judaism, the Jewish people are his chosen nation, I'm Pharaoh of Egypt, I experienced the conversations with Moses and Aaron, I experienced the 10 plagues, I know it from the inside. Nobody told me about it, I experienced it. When we leave Egypt, we take with us a lot of their wealth, gold, silver, all sorts of different material and whatever, all for transforming it to eventually be the materials that we would donate to the building of the tabernacle. So destruction isn't necessarily the best way. Rather, sometimes if you can transform rather than destroy that which used to be impure or mundane into holiness, that's really better. And that's what Saul has in mind. Agag, the king of the Amalekites, can be the same as Pharaoh in saying, look, we put 300,000 soldiers against 12,000 Israelite soldiers, and we lost. I was there. I'm the king. I can tell you from the inside. All the choicest of their sheep and cattle were to be for offerings. For God. Transformation. What's better than that? And seemingly, he's right. The big difference, though, is here we have an explicit command given to the Jewish people at large, and to him specifically by the prophet Samuel, that that's not what he's supposed to do. He's supposed to destroy everything. All other arguments and theories make no difference. It's not for discussion. We're not looking for, input. We already know what we're supposed to do in this case, and he doesn't. And that's really the problem. Samuel severely reproached Saul for this. Because you have rejected the word of God, he has rejected you as king. Samuel tell him that he would no longer be king. But the sages actually tell us that if he had not made this mistake, he would have been Mashiach. We would have had the building of the temple. We would not have had a subsequent exile. King Saul would have been Mashiach. Though Samuel then killed Agag, Agag was able to father a child in the interval between his capture by Saul and his death. That child was the ancestor of Haman. So in essence, if Saul doesn't make this mistake, there is no story of Purim. There is no Haman to put us in the danger that we need the story of Purim. The Tanakh is no mere history book. Beyond its chronicles of past events, it furnishes us with insights that can enhance our present service of God. Though the name Amalek refers to a nation that actually existed, it also describes a character trait within ourselves. Just as Amalek stood in direct opposition to the Jewish people, the trait symbolized by Amalek defies the very foundations of our divine service. When Amalek ambushed us, they encircled us. They didn't physically allow us to continue towards our goal of getting the Torah on Sinai. And so, in this simple kind of historical sense, that was 3,300 years ago. But in the more holistic, more comprehensive sense, whatever Amalek symbolizes within us keeps us from getting to Sinai, keeps us from getting to Torah, keeps us from eventually getting to the land of Israel. The Medrash describes the nature of this trait in its commentary on the verse, remember what Amalek did to you as you came forth from Egypt, how he encountered you on the road, or on the way I should say, and cut down all the weak who straggled behind you. Encountered, sometimes it's rendered as ambushed, but whatever. Literally it means happened upon you. That's the denotational translation. The Medrash explains that the Hebrew word, and I don't know why it says I-R-E, but it should be in the Hebrew, karcha, kuf, resh, chaf sofit, he encountered you, or he happened upon you, or he ambushed you, can also be rendered as he cooled you off. The word kar means cold. Karcha means made you cold, cooled you off. Amalek represents the cold rationality which makes us question everything we do or experience. Remember, when we left Egypt, we knew we were leaving not just for the sake of no longer being in servitude or no longer being in a land not our own. We knew we were leaving to get the Torah on Sinai and then to go back to the land of Israel. We were excited. So excited that we were in fact counting the days literally. Are we there yet? No, day 1. Are we there yet? No, day 2. That's pretty excited. That's hot, like on fire with excitement. Comes Amalek and he cools that excitement. To achieve complete service of God, we must transcend our own intellectual limitations. Therefore, Before the Jewish people received the Torah, they declared, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will listen. Obviously, famously explained that it should be backwards, right? First, you listen to what you're supposed to do, and then you do it. By virtue of saying we will do, and then we will listen, the idea is, we don't know what you want us to do, God. We don't really care. Consider it done. And then, oh, by the way, what is it that you want us to do? We will do refers to the desire to carry out God's will, and we will listen to the effort to understand God's commandments intellectually. By proclaiming we will do before we will listen, our ancestors implied that they would fulfill God's will without hesitation or doubt, whether they understood it or not. Of course, eventually we have to endeavor to understand. First and foremost, there's a commitment to learn Torah. Second of all, we have a brain for a reason. God gave us an intellect in order to use it. That's all fine and good. But that can never be the prerequisite for the same token. Our commitment to Torah must at all times leap beyond the limits of our understanding. A commitment of this magnitude is challenged by our internal Amalek, which tells us, by all means, accept the Torah, but wait. Consider carefully exactly how much you can study and precisely which commandments you can fulfill. Don't bite off too much. The part that cools your excitement. Within this context, we can understand the numerical equivalence between Amalek and the word suffix, the Hebrew word for doubt. Amalek causes doubt and hesitation, which cools the ardor of our divine service. Victory in our inner war with Amalek means devoting ourselves to God's service without reservations, no doubts, observing Torah with diligence and enthusiasm that are not confined by our reason. Based on this, we can understand how Saul's error in allowing Agag and the Amalekites' choice herds to live is connected to the character trait personified by Amalek. Remember that Saul had his own idea, again, for the right reasons. His intentions were pure, good, for God's sake. But he had his own intellectual understanding and theory as to what to do in this case, regardless of what the explicit command from God was via the prophet Samuel. In essence, it wasn't we will do and we will listen. It was, this is what I think I should do to serve God, how I see the situation. Saul did not intend to transgress God's will. He was an utterly righteous man, God's chosen. Describing his lofty character in their commentary on the verse, Saul was a year in his reign. Our sages explain that Saul was like a year-old child who had never tasted sin. Not just who had never sinned, but who had never tasted sin. In other words, the concept of sin didn't apply to him. A year-old child doesn't understand what it is to sin. Saul's mistake, therefore, in his dealings with Amalek, lay in following the dictates of his reason. For example, he saved the herds in order to offer them as sacrifices to God, under the mistaken impression that this service would fulfill God's intention more completely. By bringing the animals of Amalek as offerings, he wanted to demonstrate that even the elements of the world that appear to oppose God's will can be used for good. This rationale, though worthy, again, it's not that we use that kind of idea a lot, ran contrary to the explicit commandment God had relayed through his prophet. In this case, he was told, destroy everything. Thus, Samuel the prophet replied to Saul, to obey God is better than a sacrifice. Approaching him with reason alone leaves room for error. Even if no mistake is actually made, our service is flawed. Understanding prevents us from relating to the infinite dimensions of godliness. In other words, practically you might end up doing the same thing. Bezdin. They still have to go to Bezdin. Again, let's imagine in whatever scenario, it's identical. The practical result will be identical. Nevertheless, they have to go to Bezdin. Why? If it's identical, what does it matter? Because the Jewish court is the one that operates, that was established in the first place because God said so. And so, yeah, practicality aside, they're the same practical result in this particular example. The way to access God's will and wisdom is through the court that God says to go to. Not the secular court, but the Jewish court. But that, as opposed to that's what God said, that's already a problem. Ourselves, that is similarly unbounded. Only through accepting the acceptance of the yoke of heaven takes us beyond our limited selves and brings out the infinite godly potential of our souls. This quality was epitomized by Saul's successor, David, right? The big punishment for Saul is that he is replaced, he's demoted from being king, and he's replaced by King David, who describes his approach to divine service in the verse from Psalms, I have stilled and quieted myself. Hasidic philosophy points out that the word damamti, I have quieted myself, shares a root with daimem, Hebrew word, which means an inanimate object. Right, inanimate object doesn't speak, so it's quiet. That's the simple connection. In other words, David so far transcended his own natural self that he was humbled to the level of an inanimate object. Rocks don't have their own opinions on things. He became incapable of self-centered behavior. The quality of accepting the yoke of heaven is also reflected within the Purim narrative. For it was the commitment of the acceptance of the yoke of heaven that brought about the defeat of Haman, descendant of Amalek. If the existence of Haman is made possible by the lack of accepting the yoke of heaven, right? King Saul, if he had accepted the yoke of heaven, done exactly what God said, he would have killed Agag. Agag would not have had any descendants, and obviously Haman wouldn't exist. So if now Haman does exist because of that misstep, Haman's fall and demise has to be the rectification of that mistake. The ultimate in acceptance of the yoke of heaven. This is alluded to in the description of Mordechai as Ha-Yehudi, the Jew. Obviously he's Jewish. That's kind of the whole point. So how come he's called Ha-Yehudi? And more importantly, Mordechai is from the tribe of Benjamin. Mordechai is in fact the descendant of King Saul. The descendant of the man who made the mistake is now going to be the guy who rectifies that mistake. That makes sense, but how come he's not called the Benjaminite? How come he's called the Judahite? Literally, this word means a descendant of the tribe of Judah, David's tribe, whereas Mordechai was actually a Benjaminite and a relative of Saul. Likewise, throughout the Megillah, throughout the whole of the book, the entire Jewish people are called Yehudim, Jews, without distinction of tribal origin. Again, there are Judahites, that's for sure, but there's also Benjaminites, there's also Levites. For one of the derivations of this word shares a common root with Hida'ah, signifying self-effacing acknowledgement, serving God with acceptance of the yoke of heaven. Mordechai rectifies the misstep of his antecedent, where he did not have the proper acceptance of the yoke of heaven, by having the ultimate acceptance of the yoke of heaven, which makes him a Judahite. Not because he's actually from the tribe of Judah, but he's a Jew, and a Jew accepts the yoke of heaven. For indeed, Mordechai and Esther showed a complete and unquestioning commitment to God's will, even when challenged by the severest conditions. They encouraged their fellow Jews to turn to God in return or repentance to Shuvah, and strengthen their observance of Torah, even while under threat of Haman's decree. Our sages tell us that Haman definitely wanted to kill the Jews. But if a Jew renounced Judaism, Haman did not want to kill him anymore. In other words, a Jew could save himself by separating himself from Judaism, from the Jewish people. But the sages continue and explain that a miracle, one of the miracles of Purim, is that not a single Jew did that. Whereas you had Hellenized Jews, for example, in the story of Hanukkah, Jews that were actually on the side of the Greeks and fought against the Maccabees. But in the story of Purim, not a single Jew defected, as it were. Their example has a contemporary freshness to it. We too live in exile, and our commitment to Torah and the commandments is challenged by discordant voices from without and a smoothly spoken Amalek from within, which insinuates doubt and hesitation into our lives. Through acceptance of the yoke of heaven, however, we can overcome these obstacles and further sensitize our service of God. And just as in the time of Purim, the acceptance of the yoke of heaven brought light and joy, gladness and honor, which referred to the four commandments that we weren't allowed to do, main commandments that we weren't allowed to do because they represent Judaism, to the Jewish people, so too in our time it will bring success and blessing and enhance our status in the world.